Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host Tony, and today we're going to look at The Legend of Zelda, the Minish Cap, an action-adventure title developed by Capcom and Flagship and published by Nintendo for the Game Boy Advance portable console in 2004. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 143, and it is another special episode because this is another Patreon-sponsored episode. This one was sponsored by Steve. Steve did record a message for all of us to listen to about why the Minish Cap means something to him. So Steve, take it away.
Okay, I'm back. This episode of Classic Gaming Today is brought to you by me, Steve, Scale Oven Stove. The Prodigal Gamer returned. So how did we get here? Well, my Zelda journey started, like it did for many of us, way back in like 1986 with the gold cartridge on the NES, then into Zelda 2, and then on the SNES, N64, a lot of good college memories. And then things kind of took a turn. Took some time off, college. After college, family, kids, things got in the way. I kind of didn't get into the Zeldas in the 2000s. But then in 2017, got the Switch and Breath of the Wild. And what a game that is. Can't wait till that is on Classic Gaming Today. But that got me back into the Zelda universe hard. And with that, I said, I need to play the games I missed. And so on the virtual console on the Switch, they had the Minish Cap. And I was like, wow, that's cool. And I'm like, I never had a Game Boy Advance. So I got one of those and actually got the cartridge, started playing, really got into the game, loved it, loved the shrinking mechanism. Just some of the music, in that game kind of reminded me of like the Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask music at the shops and things like that. And I was like, this is really fun and awesome. And I really hope Tony has a good time playing it because I know I did. So looking forward to hearing what Tony has to say. And before I sign off, as always, thank you to everyone on Discord and in the CGT community. You are all what makes it special and fun. It's a lot of fun. Thank you all. I guess the bottom line here is this episode is for a game that proves it's never too late to discover a classic. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve, for your message, your sponsorship, and your support. If you would like to sponsor an episode or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, awards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, Left-Handed Guitarist, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Super Smash Burger, Christopher Fose, Grayor, and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show, whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis. I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context. How was the game made? Why was the game made? And then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and/or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the pantheon of classic gaming. If a game reaches the pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go. But I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day, which is The Legend of Zelda, the Minish Cap. The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap is an action-adventure title developed by Capcom and Flagship and published by Nintendo for the Game Boy Advance portable console in 2004. Before we can talk about Minish Cap, we've got to take a step back to talk about the evolution of the Legend of Zelda series in general, a franchise that throughout its entire history has been known for its stellar design and innovative gameplay mechanics, not to mention its iconic musical themes. The Legend of Zelda is undeniably one of the most well-respected franchises in all of gaming, with over 20 mainline releases in the last 40-ish years, not including spin-offs and remakes, and a level of success that's almost unparalleled within the gaming industry, with countless perfect score ratings by a number of critics across various entries, numerous Game of the Year awards, and incidentally, well over 150 million copies sold, figures that have kept the Legend of Zelda series in the pop culture spotlight literally since its inception. One of the reasons The Legend of Zelda has maintained such a prominent place in gamers' hearts and minds for so long has to do with the quality of its design, coupled with the fact that Nintendo has never been afraid of trying something new with different entries in the series, making it so that every time you pick up a new Legend of Zelda release, you're almost guaranteed to experience something you've never experienced before, even if the environments, music, characters, and general storyline are all fairly familiar between individual entries in the series. And the fact of the matter is, that level of innovation and quality was effectively part of the core DNA of the series, right from its very first entry. Before we continue, I should mention that we've had episodes on both the original Legend of Zelda as well as Ocarina of Time, arguably two of the most important releases in the history of the Zelda series. While we are going to cover a bit of that history today, if you want the full story behind the creation of both of those titles, definitely check out our prior episodes. Anyway, The original Legend of Zelda was created for the Japan-only Famicom Disk System back in 1986 by Rockstar game designer Shigeru Miyamoto, and was designed concurrently with the original Super Mario Bros., almost as two sides of the same coin. Because in the mid-80s, Nintendo was reaching an inflection point. They had just single-handedly revitalized the video game market, and as they prepared for the international launch of their 8-bit Nintendo Entertainment System, they knew that they needed to deliver a set of experiences that would capture the attention of the North American gaming market, while at the same time delivering the kinds of unique, engaging experiences that Japanese gamers had come to love, especially in light of the forthcoming Famicom Disk System release in Japan. So, Nintendo asked one of their star game designers, Shigeru Miyamoto, to take on two assignments. The first was intended to represent the pinnacle of current 8-bit game design, to be playable on a standard Famicom or NES console, while the second project was intended to represent the future of game design, leveraging all of the advanced capabilities that the Famicom Disk System would provide, like higher quality sound and, for the first time, an actual save system that didn't require passwords to store a player's progress. One game would be designed as a purely linear affair with a degree of polish that greatly exceeded other video games of the time, while the other would be designed as an entirely open-world experience, where there would be little to no hand-holding, and gamers could truly choose how and in what order they'd tackle the game's challenges. The astute amongst you might realize that one of those titles, the one designed to be a linear, albeit expertly designed affair, was the original Super Mario Bros., while the future-leaning open-world experience is what would eventually become The Legend of Zelda. While both titles were in development, Miyamoto instructed the team to capture any and all ideas that they may have had, with Miyamoto deciding which game each idea aligned more closely with, literally creating collections of proposals that were referred to as Mario ideas and Zelda ideas. The thought there was that an idea that worked for one game would not necessarily work for the other. So, Miyamoto decided to act as the arbiter of which game each idea would be applied to. The number of proposed ideas was vast, and the majority of those ideas were universally good. So each game continued to have refinements and new features added to them over the course of their respective development, until eventually, Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda would release for the Famicom in 1985 and 1986 respectively, with NES ports of each following shortly after their respective releases. To say that Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda were important releases in video game history would be a gross understatement, as both served as the first entries in what would become historic game series that have remained in the pop culture spotlight ever since their first release. Mario, Link, and Zelda rapidly became franchise characters for Nintendo, and as you might imagine, those initial releases would be followed up with a number of sequels in short order, both for Nintendo's 8-bit console ecosystem, the portable Nintendo Game Boy, as well as Nintendo's 16-bit powerhouse, the Super Famicom or Super Nintendo Entertainment System, depending on which part of the world you lived in. In almost all instances, the core team responsible for those releases included some combination of Shigeru Miyamoto, as the series creator of both Mario and Zelda, as well as other key players that contributed their talents to both families of games, perhaps most notably Koji Kondo, who composed many of the recognizable themes for each series that continue to stand the test of time. New entries in both series would prove incredibly popular to gamers around the world, and would be universally critically acclaimed. In fact, the games were so well liked and so well designed that oftentimes they would be considered system sellers by themselves. In other words, people would go out of their way to purchase a Nintendo console, simply because of the quality of these core franchise series. Sure, other games were good too, and certainly sweetened the pot for any prospective buyers. But the mere existence of Mario or Link on a Nintendo system was enough to make people consider purchasing the console, because there was no other way to experience those particular adventures, short of owning the latest and greatest Nintendo console. As the 90s progressed, Nintendo faced stiff competition from a number of companies across the video game industry, some of which, like Sega, had been longtime competitors, while others, like Sony, were new market entrants, spurred on, at least in part, by a strong desire to unseat Nintendo as the incumbent champion of home console sales. This level of competition introduced a huge amount of innovation in a relatively short period of time, as each console manufacturer tried to one-up the other by delivering ever more increasing number of bits, and significant advancements in graphics, sound, storage capacity, and control schemes, all in the hopes of winning more market share than their competitors. This degree of competition is what would prompt Nintendo to release their most advanced console to date, the Nintendo 64, as well as create 2 new games in their top franchises, Super Mario 64 and The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Now, as we continue our discussion, I'm going to stop talking about how Mario and Zelda games have often followed parallel paths throughout their history, because I really want to focus on the Zelda series from this point on. But I did think it was important to provide that joint context, simply to demonstrate conclusively a commonly held belief, which is that for Nintendo, the Legend of Zelda and Mario series are effectively on equal footing, with both being considered top-tier focus areas for the company. Anyway, with The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, Nintendo would once again deliver an experience that was incredibly innovative, and in fact, Ocarina of Time would be heralded as one of the best and most innovative games ever created, even when you consider modern perspectives on video games. One of the reasons for that recognition is, of course, the overall design and quality of the game. But the other reason why Ocarina of Time remains one of the most well-respected games in history is because of the number of innovations it would introduce to gaming, many of which would influence countless future games, while at the same time setting the standard for certain gameplay mechanics that other developers would effectively be forced to adopt if they wanted to stand a chance at comparing favorably to Nintendo's landmark title. Of all the innovations introduced with Ocarina of Time, perhaps the most significant would be those associated with 3D world design, and the way players could interact with three-dimensional worlds and the characters that inhabit those worlds. Before Ocarina of Time, game developers were still trying to figure out how best to utilize 3D technology to deliver deep, engaging experiences, and to be blunt, many of them were having a bit of a tough time. Developers around this time faced a number of challenges, with one of the most significant impediments being how to simply streamline the act of navigating three-dimensional spaces, something that we take for granted today, but back in the early to mid-90s was oftentimes cumbersome and featured unintuitive controls. Beyond the simple act of exploring 3D spaces, though, another challenge centered on how best to handle combat in 3D worlds, with many titles featuring mechanics that made targeting and hitting enemies in 3D spaces a literal hit-or-miss affair, more often leaning on the miss side of the equation. If anyone is curious about this early era of 3D gaming, just go and pick up nearly any 3D-oriented title from the early to mid-90s, and you'll see, outside of a few exceptions, that 3D gameplay was fairly cumbersome, and certainly didn't feel anything like a modern experience. Ocarina of Time would make developers reconsider how to design 3D experiences, with Miyamoto and team coming up with new mechanics to govern 3D world exploration, as well as enemy targeting and combat, with the concept of Z-targeting in particular being a major leap forward for three-dimensional combat and gameplay. Z-targeting, for those who may not know, provided a way to lock onto your target while keeping your perspective fixed on the enemy you're attempting to fight, making it so that the common pitfalls of other 3D titles, namely not being able to adequately target and attack your enemies, were, for the most part, no longer an issue. This new method of 3D combat and movement would end up being a major innovation that dramatically influenced future 3D titles. But it was far from the only innovation that Ocarina of Time introduced to the gaming industry en route to becoming one of the best reviewed games in the history of gaming. And just in case anyone thinks I'm being hyperbolic, well, I'm not. Ocarina of Time is, in fact, the best reviewed game of all time, at least according to the review aggregation website Metacritic. Whether you personally agree with that assessment or not, the fact is, Ocarina of Time was truly a monumental release in gaming history. Ocarina of Time would be followed up with another 3D Zelda adventure, that being Majora's Mask in the year 2000, a title that would end up taking advantage of the Ocarina of Time engine to once again deliver a meaningful, worthwhile experience for gamers around the world to enjoy. While Majora's Mask wouldn't be quite as critically or commercially successful as Ocarina of Time, and it would mostly iterate as opposed to innovate, it still served as a standout release for the Nintendo 64, and proved, once again, that any new release in the Legend of Zelda series was cause for celebration. After the release of Majora's Mask, Nintendo would begin to think about their next foray into the Kingdom of Hyrule, and as their internal teams began to gear up for the inevitable next entry in the Legend of Zelda series, a semi-related event would occur that, up to this point, would have been almost unthinkable. Like we've been talking about, the Legend of Zelda series is one of Nintendo's core franchises, and as you might expect, the Big N wasn't likely to trust anyone other than themselves to develop a title in that storied franchise. I mean, sure, you had the Philips CDI trilogy of Zelda titles, but those only came about as a result of a licensing deal that Nintendo and Philips had entered into back when Nintendo was trying to create a CD-ROM-based add-on for their Super Nintendo Entertainment System, an initiative that would ultimately be cancelled, but not before Philips was able to release several titles using prized Nintendo characters, like Zelda, Link, and Mario. But outside of the CDI Zelda series, all of which have been effectively disavowed by Nintendo, every single Zelda game created from 1986 through the year 2000 was developed internally by Nintendo's best and brightest game designers, developers, artists, and musicians. And after work on Majora's Mask was completed, that same group of talented individuals would begin working on the next internally developed Nintendo Zelda title, an effort that would eventually culminate in the release of The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker in 2002. Outside of Wind Waker, though, Nintendo didn't have plans to deliver any additional Zelda titles during the couple years following the release of Majora's Mask. That, however, would all change following a discussion between Nintendo legend Shigeru Miyamoto and fellow influential and commercially successful game designer Yoshiki Okamoto in early 1999, after which a brand new set of Zelda adventures would be approved for development. The only caveat? These new titles would be developed by a group of individuals outside of Nintendo's core team. In 1997, Okamoto had led the formation of a brand new development studio named Flagship, a subsidiary of Capcom that was founded to focus on improving the quality of narratives in video games, an area that was widely considered to be lacking across the gaming industry, especially in comparison to the narrative quality typically found in films and television shows. In order to address that perceived gap, Flagship would end up hiring a number of actual film and television scriptwriters to join the more traditional game design and development staff that made up the majority of the company, many of whom were individuals who had previously worked with gaming giants Capcom, Sega, and Nintendo. And interestingly, the initial funding for Flagship's creation would in fact come from those three companies, effectively making it so that Capcom, Sega, and Nintendo were pseudo-partners who could contract with Flagship to support whatever titles any of the companies might individually be working on. For Sega, that meant that Flagship would be tasked with creating a series of episodic role-playing games for the Sega Saturn, an effort that would ultimately never result in any released products. For Capcom, the company would assist with the creation of some of the company's biggest hits, like Resident Evil 2, Dino Crisis 2, and Onimusha Warlords. And for Nintendo? Well, that one requires a bit of a deeper explanation. In early 1999, Flagship founder Yoshiki Okamoto scheduled a meeting with Shigeru Miyamoto to pitch a brand new idea. Okamoto wanted to revisit the original Legend of Zelda, the same 1986 title that Miyamoto had brought to life earlier in his career, only he wanted to remake that original Zelda adventure using modern technology, while also making the game more accessible for younger players. Okamoto believed that The Legend of Zelda was an outstanding game, but he also believed that the game was a bit too challenging for children to play and enjoy. He believed that Flagship could potentially remake The Legend of Zelda into a better experience for younger players, with the end goal of releasing that proposed remake for Nintendo's Game Boy Color portable console, thereby reaching an entirely new population and generation of gamers. Beyond that remake, though, Okamoto suggested that if Flagship could deliver a high-quality, commercially successful take on The Legend of Zelda, then he wanted the opportunity to develop an even more full-featured standalone Zelda title, one untethered to any prior entry, and a game that would, hopefully, prove how talented the Flagship team truly was. Miyamoto listened to Okamoto's pitch and pretty much agreed to the proposal on the spot. Flagship would be allowed to remake the original Legend of Zelda as a Game Boy Color title for modern audiences, and in the process, Nintendo would receive a sort of free publicity that would hopefully keep one of their flagship franchises in the pop culture spotlight while they continued to work internally on the forthcoming release of The Wind Waker. For Nintendo, there was very little risk with the deal, as if Flagship didn't deliver a quality title, then Nintendo could simply cancel the license without any adverse impact to the company's reputation. Flagship, on the other hand, would have to shoulder both the risk of failure as well as the potential of success, a duality that the company believed was more good than bad, especially considering how popular the Legend of Zelda series was with gamers across the world. With hopes of a successful future release propelling the company forward, Flagship would begin working on their Legend of Zelda remake in 1999, as Miyamoto and the rest of Nintendo staff turned their attention back to their own internal Zelda projects, confident that Flagship would be able to follow through on their end of the deal. As Flagship began working on their Zelda remake, they quickly came to the conclusion that the original game's challenge was tied to nearly every aspect of the game's design, from the enemies to the gameplay mechanics to the overall size and structure of the game world and its various dungeons, which meant that what the team originally assumed would be a fairly straightforward simplification of the original world, in reality would be anything but straightforward. The team would begin to modify various aspects of the original game, each of which would have to be balanced and rebalanced with one another in order to maintain the quality and overall design of The Legend of Zelda. Over time, however, these changes would begin to become fairly dramatic, so much so that at one point in the game's development, Flagship leadership looked at the game and couldn't even recognize it as a remade version of The Legend of Zelda. The game featured an entirely new world map, a brand new storyline, new characters, and altered mechanics, just to name a few of the differences, which, in case anyone is wondering, is a pretty far deviation from the concept of a quote-unquote faithful remake kind of experience. By all accounts, Flagship had jumped right past remake territory, and were instead creating the equivalent of a brand new game. Okamoto was concerned with how work on the game was progressing, though he still believed that the project could be salvaged, if only he and the team could get a little guidance. So, as many game designers often did, Okamoto reached out to Shigeru Miyamoto to get his feedback, and hopefully get some ideas as to the best way for the team to proceed. Miyamoto, being the creative genius that he is, took one look at Flagship's work and determined that Okamoto was right. The game he and Flagship had been creating was not a direct remake of the original Legend of Zelda, but was instead a different experience entirely. Rather than be disappointed though, Miyamoto saw this as an opportunity, as perhaps the team could use the extensive work they had already completed to reimagine the concept behind the original Legend of Zelda, rather than remake it. Miyamoto's suggestion involved the creation of not one, but 3 different games in the Zelda universe, each of which would focus on different types of gameplay mechanics, with each one corresponding to a specific piece of the Triforce, which is the major relic in the Legend of Zelda series that provided the impetus behind the original game's quest. The integrated Triforce itself consists of 3 pieces: the Triforce of Wisdom, the Triforce of Power, and the Triforce of Courage, and Miyamoto considered that if different games could be created that corresponded to each of those Triforce elements, then perhaps Flagship would have a hit, or rather a series of hits, on their hands. Okamoto loved Miyamoto's suggestions, and he returned back to the Flagship team with a brand new set of ideas for how to turn their current work into a collection of games that would be dubbed the Triforce series, a reference to the fact that each game would be aligned with, and would focus on, one of the 3 pieces of the Hylian Triforce. Converting and expanding Flagship's initial work would commence shortly after Okamoto relayed Miyamoto's suggestions to the team, and while over the course of their development the original 3-game concept would be reduced to 2, the end result was still exactly what Flagship wanted all along, as they would release the incredibly well-received sister titles, The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages in 2001. Both Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages were designed to interact with one another, with a number of different items and upgrades only becoming available to players if they had already played one of the other games, similar in some respects to how the Pokemon series' paired releases maintained a set of exclusive Pokemon restricted to one specific release versus the other. The Oracle titles would take things a step further, as if a player would complete one of the games, he or she would be treated to an entirely different experience in the other title, with the game changing its plot points and general narrative structure to enable it to act as a sequel to whatever title someone would play first, rather than as a standalone experience. This kind of interaction between titles had very rarely been attempted before, but despite its rarity, the simple fact is, Flagship successfully brought that feature to life. And you know what? Gamers and critics alike would take notice of Flagship's Zelda titles, as both Oracle games would sell almost 4 million copies each, en route to being named by many publications as two of the best games of the year. Flagship had succeeded in delivering two unique, high-quality Zelda experiences, titles that were arguably as well made as those created by the core Nintendo Zelda team. As both games continued to sell well, and numerous players and critics declared the games to be some of the best games available for Nintendo's Game Boy Color, one question started to arise. What was next for Flagship? Well, it turns out the answer to that question was, in fact, more Zelda, as after the success of Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, Flagship would be tasked by Nintendo to create another entry in the venerable Zelda series, this one intended from the beginning to be a brand new standalone experience, effectively representing the Zelda game that Flagship and Okamoto always wanted to make. Flagship obviously leapt at the opportunity, which is what would enable the team to begin development on the title that would eventually come to be known as The Legend of Zelda, the Minish Cap. As the team began brainstorming various mechanics and features to include in the game, attention gravitated towards the concept of allowing Link to become a miniature version of himself, using the titular Minish Cap, which would then allow players to explore various environments from multiple perspectives. The normal-sized view of the world that forms the foundation of most games, and a mini-sized view of the world, where common objects like flowers or insects might appear to be gargantuan, given Link's more diminutive stature while using the Minish Cap. This kind of dual-world concept felt like a perfect inclusion for a Zelda title, which as a series has always explored the concept of duality in its various entries. As an example, in the Super Nintendo title A Link to the Past, players have the opportunity to explore both the normal Hyrule countryside as well as a dark world version of the landscape. In Ocarina of Time, players can be both young Link and older Link as they explore a singular world that exists in two different times, each with their own challenges to conquer, puzzles to solve, and items to acquire. Even Flagship's own Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons titles demonstrated this duality, with two different but interrelated games for players to complete. Having a game containing both normal and miniature-sized versions of different environments, each with their own enemies, encounters, characters, and gameplay, seemed like a natural fit for the Zelda series, and it did not take long before that concept became the core mechanic around which most of the Minish Cap would be designed. With the game's general direction and design finalized, work would begin on the content that would make up the rest of the overall experience, with the team taking visual inspiration from Wind Waker as they created a toon-like aesthetic for Minish Cap, with additional attention paid to the game's fairy tale-like story, as well as its major hub city, Hyrule Town, which was designed to be as close to a living, breathing representation of an in-game city as was possible given the technology of the time, with different characters living their lives and performing various tasks independent of player input. Various additional features would be added to the game over the course of its development, including the suite of usable items that players could find throughout their adventure, the dungeon and overworld environments, both normal and miniature-sized, that would make up the game's various explorable locations, and the quest and side activities that players would undertake as they worked their way through the title, many of which were optional, but ultimately provided a tangential benefit to inquisitive and thorough players. Despite the game's miniature-focused, Flagship was dedicated to delivering a full-length, high-quality Zelda adventure. The only question was, would their collective efforts be rewarded with critical and commercial success? The answer to that question would come in late 2004 into early 2005, as The Legend of Zelda The Minish Cap would be released in Japan and Europe in November of 2004, with North American and Australian releases following several months later, representing the first time in the series' history that a Zelda title would release in Europe before North America. Now, some of you might be wondering why the Minish Cap released in Europe before it made its way to North America, and the simple answer to that question is the Nintendo DS. Minish Cap was designed to be a Game Boy Advance title, and Nintendo believed strongly in the work Flagship had completed on the game, with Nintendo of Europe in particular believing the game could be their biggest release of the 2004 holiday season. With the Nintendo DS scheduled to release in Europe in the spring of 2005, Nintendo wanted to create some space between the DS launch and Minish Cap's release, so it made sense to accelerate the European launch to November of 2004. At the same time, the Nintendo DS was scheduled to launch in North America at the end of November 2004, and Nintendo of America believed that releasing a new Zelda title for the Game Boy Advance around the same time as the Nintendo DS made its way to market might have impacted DS sales, as gamers spent their hard-earned dollars on the newest Zelda rather than Nintendo's shiny new portable console, which is why Minish Cap would release early in Europe and later in North America. Anyway, once the game did release across all geographic territories, it was quickly apparent that Flagship had in fact created a title worthy of the Zelda name, as Minish Cap would be critically acclaimed and commercially successful, selling almost 2 million copies around the world, which incidentally was one of the lower-selling Zelda releases, but was still good enough to warrant recognition as a certified hit when compared to the majority of games across the industry. Beyond its commercial success, Minish Cap would be nominated for a number of industry awards in the year following its release, including Best Handheld Game of the Year by several different publications, and in later years, the game would be recognized as one of the best Game Boy Advance games of all time, and a worthy entry in the Legend of Zelda series, despite its comparatively lower sales figures, and the fact that it was developed by Flagship and not Nintendo's own staff. Unfortunately for Flagship, however, Minish Cap would be the last time the company would work on a title in the Zelda series, as a couple of years after Minish Cap's release, the company would be integrated within the broader Capcom organization, meaning that the entity Flagship ceased to exist after 2007. Luckily for all involved, every one of Flagship's talented staff would maintain their jobs under this new integration, which is definitely a good news story at the end of the day. But it's still a bit unfortunate when smaller companies get consumed by larger organizations, if only because the recognition and knowledge of those smaller companies can sometimes get lost in the shuffle. Regardless, the fact is that Flagship, while it did exist, was able to make a name for itself through the raw talent and skills of the individuals that worked at the company, and nowhere is that more evident than in the team's collective work on the 3 Zelda titles that graced Nintendo's portable consoles in the early 2000s. With Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, Flagship demonstrated that a company not named Nintendo could create a worthwhile Zelda adventure, while with Minish Cap, the company proved that their previous success was not a fluke, but was instead the result of the hard work and dedication of a talented team of designers, developers, artists, and others. Obviously, The Legend of Zelda as a series continues to maintain a prominent spot in video game pop culture, and will always be known as one of the most important franchises in video game history. But it is equally important to shine a spotlight on the individual efforts that contributed to make the Zelda series as important and influential as it is, which is why Flagship, and Minish Cap by extension, certainly deserve to be remembered. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap today versus when it was released just a little bit over 20 years ago. At its core, The Minish Cap can best be described as a Legend of Zelda title, which I know sounds like a cop-out, but legitimately this is the best way to describe the game. If you've ever played a top-down Zelda title like Link to the Past, or more recently A Link Between Worlds, then you know exactly what you're getting here, with a two-dimensional tops-down perspective featuring a world filled with enemies to defeat, secrets to uncover, items to discover, and dungeons to delve. What struck me most about Minish Cap was just how much of a Zelda game it really is, which I recognize sounds like a really silly thing to say, but to explain why I had that reaction, it probably makes sense to go over my own personal experience with the Legend of Zelda series, which will hopefully help everyone understand where I'm coming from. When I was younger, I played extensively almost every single mainline Legend of Zelda title that it released up through the late 90s. That includes the original 2 games on the NES, A Link to the Past on the Super NES, and Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask on the Nintendo 64. Conspicuously absent from that list, you may have noticed, was Link's Awakening, the Game Boy title that shrunk down a Zelda-styled adventure into a format that could literally fit in your pocket. Now, some of you may be wondering why the heck I would skip Link's Awakening, considering how much of a Zelda fan I was, and how much I continue to be a Zelda fan even today. The reasoning behind my decision was simply that when the Game Boy first came out, and even for a few years later, I had a preconceived and prejudicial notion that Game Boy versions of existing game series would be too compromised to be a truly worthwhile experience. The small screen, the non-existent color palette, the limited control scheme in comparison to the state-of-the-art of the time, which for the early 90s was the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. All of those limitations made me believe that the Game Boy was a better system for short, pick-up-and-play arcade-styled experiences as opposed to a deep, engaging Zelda adventure. I didn't care what the reviews said. I didn't care what friends told me. My belief, for better or worse, was that Link's Awakening was going to be a pale imitation of the original Legend of Zelda, and I, for one, was not here for it. Before anyone sharpens their pitchforks and grabs their torches, I need to clarify that I recognize my perception at the time was deeply flawed, and I would eventually address my misconception, and in the process would discover that Link's Awakening was actually quite the charming and engaging pocket-sized Zelda experience. In fact, in many ways, it was as good, if not better than, the original Legend of Zelda, a realization that took me by surprise when I finally did sit down to play the game just a few years ago. Despite the fact that I now knew better, a lifetime worth of preconceived notions is a difficult thing to combat. Even after playing and enjoying Link's Awakening, I never went back to explore the other handheld entries in the Legend of Zelda series, other than A Link Between Worlds, which appealed to me solely because it was a sort of sequel to A Link to the Past, a game I simply adored. Other handheld entries like the Oracle series, Phantom Hourglass, Spirit Tracks, and today's focus Minish Cap simply went unplayed because my perception was that these games would be quote-unquote Zelda-light experiences. And in a day and age where you had games like Breath of the Wild to devour, the thought of going back to a portable, less feature-rich set of games just didn't appeal to me. So I never played the handheld Zelda games when they were actively being developed and released. And other than Link's Awakening, I haven't yet gone back to play those older portable titles. Which means, when I sat down to play Minish Cap, I assumed the game was going to be good because it was a Zelda title, but I honestly wasn't expecting a super deep experience. I figured that Minish Cap would be a Zelda title that played it fairly safe, with a handful of dungeons, some heart pieces to find, items to use, puzzles to solve, and all of the traditional Zelda staples you'd expect, but I wasn't expecting a remarkable experience. Well, after playing and beating Minish Cap, I can affirmatively say that my initial assumptions were entirely wrong, because Minish Cap is perhaps one of the finest two-dimensional Zelda titles ever created, and is certainly one of, if not the, best portable Zelda title ever made. To understand why that is, we need to talk about the things Minish Cap does that adheres to the traditional Zelda formula, as well as the things that make Minish Cap a unique experience. When you sit down to play Minish Cap, you'll quickly discover that all of the core Zelda gameplay elements are here, and all of them are as fully featured as any other two-dimensional Zelda experience, regardless of the console those titles originated on. You'll be presented with a world that, admittedly, is a smidge small, at least in terms of the overworld size, though within that somewhat condensed world is a huge amount of variety in environments and enemies, and an absolutely ridiculous number of secrets to find. You'll explore forests, lakes, mountaintops, waterfall-laden canyons, castles, grasslands, poisonous swamps, graveyards, and more. Not to mention the various dungeons you'll end up diving into to eventually gather the items you need to complete the game. In all instances, the environments in the game are designed exceptionally well, with every single location feeling like an interconnected part of a fully fleshed out world. I especially enjoyed the fact that different enemy types were native to different environments and locations, which served to make each location feel like it was its own little section of the broader, incredibly diverse game world. And speaking of the game world, as you explore your surroundings, you'll come across different locations, features, and landmarks that you just know are hiding some sort of secret. And if you're like me, you'll make a mental note of each of these locations to return to later in your adventure. Because, just like the majority of Zelda titles, there are a number of obstacles and puzzles in the game world that can only be solved by acquiring a specific item or sets of items, and most of the time, those items can only be discovered by diving into the game's dungeons, which we'll talk about in a little bit. As an example, let's say you see a hole in the ground at the base of a cliff. Because this is a Zelda game, you know you're going to eventually be able to do something with that hole that will enable you to ascend that cliff. You just don't know what that something is until you find the corresponding item, which in this case is a staff that can power up holes in the ground to fire you higher into the air. There are a huge number of these kinds of obstacles embedded throughout the game, many of which serve to gate your overall exploration to align with the major story beats that the game delivers to you on a regular basis. This is pretty much par for the course for a Zelda title, though I will admit that some of the environmental obstacles started to feel a bit arbitrary the more I played the game. When I explore a game, I want to be able to really explore it, and I'm the kind of gamer that often goes off the beaten path to try to discover hidden secrets, oftentimes without regard to story progression or where the game wants me to explore. I recognize when I play a Zelda game or a Metroidvania that my progress is going to be restricted, since that's part of certain games' designs. And going into Minish Cap, I fully expected to be hit with the same kind of thing, which admittedly is exactly what happened. Conceptually, that is not an issue, but I did feel like some of the location designs in Minish Cap were a bit over the top with limiting exploration, especially in the early to mid portions of the game. The restrictions were so numerous, in fact, that I often lost track of different areas that I wanted to come back to, simply because there were so many spots that required specific items that my normal approach to backtracking became a bit more cumbersome than I personally enjoy. This wasn't a huge issue, and overall the game's locations and item-based puzzles were designed incredibly well. But I would be lying if I didn't at least mention that I felt some portions of the game were designed to discourage exploration rather than encouraging coming back later to uncover even more secrets. And those secrets, by the way, run the gamut from hidden heart pieces used to augment your total hit point pool, magical items and weapons that serve to increase your overall abilities and puzzle-solving potential, caches of rupees to enlarge your bank account, kinstones to unlock even more secrets, and skills to increase your overall combat prowess. Of these, the majority of secrets are pretty normal to find in a Zelda game, though I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the final two items on that list: kinstones and combat arts, because they are, to the best of my knowledge, unique to Minish Cap, or at least they are unique in comparison to other Zelda games that I've personally played. The hidden combat arts are the most similar to other Zelda titles, where occasionally you'll get an additional skill that serves to increase your combat abilities, which is exactly what you'll find with the combat arts in Minish Cap, known in the game as Tiger Scrolls. What is unique, however, is how some of the combat arts you receive here are the equivalent of default skills in other Zelda titles, which to me was a bit of an odd design choice. As an example, you know Link's fairly common sword beam attack, where if he has full hit points and swings a sword, a magical beam shoots out from the tip of the sword to attack enemies? In many Zelda games, that's just a default move, or perhaps tied to acquiring an individual game's version of the Master Sword. In Minish Cap, however, that's a skill that needs to be learned, which isn't particularly challenging, as all you have to do is talk to the right person in the right town, but I did find it interesting that such an iconic move is potentially missable, as there is no progression-based requirement to direct you to the individual that teaches you that particular move. I found this to be a bit strange and a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, the concept of learning new skills as you play the game and become better equipped is awesome, and some of the unique skills you can learn in Minish Cap, like the ability to fire sword beams when you're low on health and not just when you have full hit points, is an intriguing addition to the traditional Zelda formula. On the other hand, requiring you to learn skills that in many other Zelda games are simply a part of Link's default moveset felt a little bit odd to me, at least in comparison to other Zelda experiences that I've had. And speaking of those Zelda experiences, one of the core features of every one of those games is discovering secrets, like we just talked about, and this is yet another way that Minish Cap evolves the traditional Zelda formula. Because rather than simply needing to bomb the right wall or burn the right bush in order to discover a well-hidden secret, Minish Cap adds a new wrinkle to the secret discovery formula, that being the inclusion of kinstones. Kinstones are a type of item you can acquire, sometimes related to story progression, but oftentimes fairly random, with the core concept behind them being that they can be merged with other individuals' kinstones to create completed emblems that, in the words of the game, will usually make something good happen. There are a variety of kinstones of different colors and shapes in the game, and your goal is to find the right type of kinstones to merge with kinstones that other non-player characters may have, which will then unlock some secret somewhere in the game's world. Occasionally, those secrets will lead to something truly special, like a piece of a heart or a magical item that would otherwise be unobtainable. Most of the time, though, they result in a treasure chest appearing in some random location that contains either rupees or potentially mysterious shells, which is another type of in-game currency that we'll talk about in a little bit. I've got to say, I'm somewhat mixed on the kinstone system, because I can see the potential of yet another secret discovery mechanic in the game, and if the kinstones always resulted in a meaningful reward, I think I would be praising this mechanic as an awesome addition to the game. But a good chunk of the time, kinstones led to random rupees in random locations, and honestly, I just wasn't all that inspired to trek to various locations in the game world just to get more rupees, a unit of currency that was already overflowing from my several times upgraded wallet. I appreciated the addition of kinstones to the game, I just think that they could have been made a bit more meaningful if the number of kinstone encounters were reduced, but the impact of those discoveries was made greater. Anyway, moving beyond kinstones, I mentioned a new unit of currency a minute ago, that being the mysterious shell, which serves one singular purpose in Minish Cap. There is a vendor located in Hyrule Village that sells small figurines of what appear to be all of the monsters in the game, of which there are well over 100. You can think of this as a sort of internal game monster and character compendium, with later entries requiring more and more mysterious shells to improve your chances of getting a unique figurine, and therefore a new entry in your Monster Almanac. This, I will admit, is a mechanic that I didn't really spend any time with, because I didn't see the value in spending the time needed to unlock each entry in the bestiary. For 100% completionists, this provides an additional achievement, so to speak, in the game, but I personally wasn't super interested in this particular aspect of the title. I am glad it was included, it just wasn't for me based on how I was feeling when I played the game. Up to this point, we've talked a fair amount about how Minish Cap adheres to and evolves the traditional Zelda formula, though interestingly, we haven't yet talked about the major new mechanic added to the game, and the one that gives the game its title, the Minish Cap. In Minish Cap, you have a unique ability that allows you to shrink yourself to the size of a Picori, which in the context of Zelda is effectively the equivalent of an ancient fairy-like race. As a miniature Link, you'll gain access to a number of different areas in the game that you wouldn't otherwise have access to, and as you play the game, you'll quickly learn that whenever you see one of several objects that allow you to change your size, you're probably near a puzzle or secret that requires miniaturizing yourself in order to progress, a way of telegraphing that something important is here. You just need to find it. Navigating the normal world as a miniature Link is incredibly limiting, as areas of the world that would otherwise be easily traversable are now entirely unpassable, and when I first started playing the game, I felt like Mini Link was almost too limited to be engaging. I mean, by default, you pretty much can't do anything as Mini Link other than walk around, at least in the normal sections of the game world. What I came to discover, though, is that the real beauty of Mini Link's form comes as you explore the sections of the game that were designed intentionally as miniature exploration zones, which from my perspective were simply awesome. Having a miniature character move around an oversized environment is not a new concept for games, or movies, or general pop culture, but for some reason, the concept never really gets old. I don't know why it feels so cool to walk around an oversized microscopic environment that you would otherwise never see, but it really is a feeling that I can't get enough of. In Minish Cap, this sentiment is exploited to great effect, as Link will walk around small patches of dirt with inch-long leaves that, because of his miniature form, feel like forests, with huge leaf-based canopies blocking light from reaching the ground. Or he may approach what the game refers to as a quote-unquote waterfall, which in reality is just a water fountain, but as a miniature being, it takes on a whole new meaning. These little touches are peppered throughout the game, and exploring each and every miniature but oversized environment feels like a breath of fresh air every time you encounter a new area to explore. Mini-Link form will also play a role in a number of puzzles throughout the game, including several boss fights and dungeons, which I thought was a nice touch and served to shine an even brighter spotlight on Minish Cap's most unique gameplay mechanic. Yet another mechanic that will play a role in a number of puzzles is an ability that allows you to duplicate yourself up to 4 times, assuming you can find a set of special glowing pads on the ground and execute a special maneuver that will become upgraded as you play the game and gather more of the plot-centric items that you need to retrieve in order to beat the game. This is one of those mechanics that is both conceptually awesome and fun to use, for the most part, with the only major issue I have with the mechanic being that if you hit anything while attempting to make copies of yourself, the copy progress will reset, forcing you to restart that process from the beginning. This kind of thing will happen more than you might expect, because the way you begin copying yourself is by holding down your sword attack button, which, as in other Zelda titles, will make you extend your sword in whatever direction you're facing as that move charges up. The issue is, if that sword comes into contact with anything, like, say, a passing enemy, your charge meter resets, and in some sections of the game with a number of enemies wandering around, it can sometimes become a bit cumbersome to complete your Link duplication ritual successfully. It never really detracts from your enjoyment of the game, aside from a couple late-game sections that can become pretty irritating when a fast-moving enemy inadvertently resets your progress, which kinda sucks. Generally speaking though, this is an aspect of the game I really enjoyed, as it made for even more diverse puzzles, both in the various overworld sections of the game, as well as the dungeons peppered throughout Minish Cap. And speaking of dungeons, Minish Cap has them, and boy are they pretty darn awesome. The interesting thing here is that there are only 4 plot-based items you need to acquire in order to beat the game, which you might think would mean that there are only 4 dungeons in the game, similar to how each piece of the Triforce was housed in a different singular dungeon in the original Legend of Zelda. Even the game helpfully indicates 4 general dungeon locations on your in-game map an hour or 2 into your quest, serving to point you in the direction of the main plot-based progression items you'll need to work your way throughout the game. I'm not going to give away any spoilers here, but suffice it to say, you will have way more than 4 dungeons to complete as you play the game, with some overworld sections of the game even serving as a form of open-world dungeon complete with puzzles to solve and discoveries to unlock. In all instances, dungeons are designed impeccably well, and serve as some of the more interesting and well-integrated dungeon delving experiences in any 2-dimensional Zelda title. I will admit that I experienced occasional frustrations with some of the dungeons, where I didn't really know where I needed to go or what I needed to do in order to progress, but those moments were few and far between. For the most part, the dungeons in Minish Cap were amazing experiences, and I'd put them up against the dungeons in any other Zelda title I've personally experienced as something that, for the most part, is the gold standard by which other Zelda dungeons should be measured. Boss fights in those dungeons, by contrast, can be a bit of a mixed bag. For the most part, each boss fight was engaging and had unique mechanics that needed to be figured out in order to defeat them, which is pretty much a core staple in any quality Zelda experience. For some reason though, I found myself not loving every boss encounter, and in particular, the final boss fight ended up being more tedious than thrilling. The biggest issue with that multi-stage encounter is that if you fail at any point along the way, you need to restart the whole thing over. But not just from the first part of the boss fight itself. You actually get sent back farther in the game, needing to complete a mini gauntlet of tough enemies before you even return to that boss fight, which I've got to say I was not a fan of. In comparison to other classic titles that didn't respect a player's time at all, this was a very minor annoyance, and only represented a couple of minutes of additional rework that could have potentially been avoided. But I admit that it did take me a bit out of the action when it happened, when all I really wanted to do was figure out the boss's mechanics and attempt to put my strategy into motion. Like I said, not a huge deal, but something that I found could have been smoothed over just a little bit. Other than the final boss fight of the game though, I'd say maybe half of the other boss encounters were super fun and engaging experiences, while the other half were a bit more tedious than I would have preferred. The good did outweigh the bad here, but admittedly, the boss fights in Minish Cap were not my favorite part of the overall experience. I do have more to say about the more specific aspects of the game, which we're going to get to in just a couple minutes. But first, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have YouTube with all sorts of gameplay videos. Back then, most of the time, our buying decisions were made based on word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we may have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for The Legend of Zelda, the Minish Cap for the Game Boy Advance portable console. The back of the box says, "The magic of the Minish Cap. When the sorcerer Vadi turns Princess Zelda to stone, the King of Hyrule sends Link on a quest that will take him to places he's never imagined. Using the power of a mystical hat called the Minish Cap, the Hylian hero will shrink down for a massive quest on a microscopic scale. Use the magic of the cap to shrink and explore the world of the Minish lying hidden just beneath your feet. With the help of all new items like the Gust Jar and the Mole Mitts, shoot blasts of air or claw through dirt to reach new regions. And unravel the secrets of the Kinstones to solve puzzles, unlock hidden areas, and restore happiness to the people of Hyrule." And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box which make the game look like a Zelda game, which of course it is, and I've got to say, yep, this one sells me 150% because Zelda games are simply awesome, 2D Zelda games are amazing, and this looks like a 2D Zelda game with all of the stuff that you would expect with it. Yes, this one sells me entirely. If this weren't a Zelda game though, I think I would still be sold, but the fact is that being a Zelda game, there are certain preconceived notions that I have, and having played a ton of Zelda games over time, I pretty much know what to expect here, or at least I figured I would know what to expect here. And yeah, this would have been an absolute purchase if I was into portable Zelda gaming back when it first came out. Like I mentioned earlier, I actually was not. But today, having righted many of those wrongs, I recognize that yes, this is definitely one that I would want on my shelf. We're going to move on to talk about the more specific aspects of the game now, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Minish Cap are outstanding, with a perfect pixel art styled combination of environments, characters, items, and monsters that make you feel like you're playing a truly classic Zelda adventure, which technically Minish Cap is. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that Minish Cap featured some of the best graphics in a two-dimensional Zelda title that I've ever seen. And that's saying something, especially when you consider such standouts as A Link to the Past and its sequel, Link Between Worlds. I appreciated the overall art direction in the game, which included not just pixel art-driven visuals, but also included an almost cartoon Wind Waker-like aesthetic that made the entire experience feel like a really intriguing mix of old-school Zelda adventures combined with more modern takes on the franchise. In all instances, this totally worked for me, and I loved the way Minish Cap looked. Animations, meanwhile, were all smooth and detailed, with both enemy attacks and your own movements being expertly crafted to deliver a feast for the eyes. Every aspect of Minish Cap's visual environment was outstanding, and I have no complaints at all about how the game looked. Moving on to the sound and music, similar to the game's visuals, the sound and music in Minish Cap is perfect, with a varied, well-composed soundtrack that feels right at home in a Zelda adventure, despite the fact that longtime Zelda composer Koji Kondo was not directly responsible for the game's soundtrack. While the new songs composed exclusively for Minish Cap were all high-quality experiences, I have to admit that my favorite tracks were those that presented new takes on older Zelda themes, like the Fairy Fountain theme, the Overworld theme, and, perhaps the best song in the whole game, a subdued, creepy version of the Dungeon theme, otherwise known as the Royal Crypt, from the original Legend of Zelda NES release. That is so good that I had a literal fanboy moment when I heard the song for the first time while playing a late game section of Minish Cap. The rest of the music, whether derived from an older theme or brand new for Minish Cap, is all excellent, and this stands as one of the better holistic game soundtracks that I've heard in recent memory. Every single song is great, and I legitimately don't believe there's a lower quality entry in the whole soundtrack. Sound effects, meanwhile, all align with expectations from a Zelda title, with the appropriate amount of yelps, sword clangs, magical zaps, and everything else that you typically associate with a Zelda adventure. There is not much more to say here, other than to reaffirm that the sound effects are perfect, as is the music, which creates an auditory experience that rivals every other Zelda game, regardless of whether it's a modern incarnation or a classic release. Moving on to the narrative and story, in Minish Cap, you play as Link, a young boy who needs to save Princess Zelda and the Kingdom of Hyrule from an evil swordsman who is hell-bent on obtaining godlike power to shape the world into his own twisted vision of paradise. After a particularly powerful incantation is placed upon Zelda, turning her to stone, Link realizes that he needs to grab his adventuring equipment and get to work. Luckily, however, he's not alone in his adventure, as a magical race of miniature beings, the Picori, have taken up residence in Hyrule, and along with them, a magical anthropomorphic cat known as the Minish Cap decides to assist Link in saving Zelda and putting a stop to the evil madman that is attempting to take over the world. This Cap, who in reality is a cursed Minish sage named Eslo, joins Link as he explores an expansive world filled with various enemies to defeat, artifacts to recover, and secrets to unearth. The only question is, will Link be able to save Zelda and the kingdom? Or will Hyrule and the princess be lost forever? The story in Minish Cap 100% worked for me more than I expected it to. I'm very familiar with traditional Zelda-styled narratives, and while I always enjoy the unique stories that accompany each Zelda game, I don't know that I'd ever claim Zelda titles are the most story-rich titles. Minish Cap doesn't really do anything to change that perception, but its story is constructed well, and for a Zelda title, is pretty darn engaging while giving you a real and meaningful purpose to all of the adventuring you'll end up doing throughout the game. It's not the deepest of narratives, but it is just enough to keep you interested as you play the game. And for a game whose gameplay, puzzles, and action-adventure stylings take center stage, you can't ask for much more. Moving on to the playability and controls, we've already talked a good deal about the general structure of the game, though we haven't yet touched upon the overall controls for the game, which are, to put it simply, perfect for the pocket-sized adventure you'll be experiencing as you play Minish Cap. Similar to several other Zelda titles over the years, you have the ability to map both your A and B buttons to various items that you may have in your inventory, including weapons like your sword, defensive equipment like your shield, and utility items like a lantern that lights up dark spaces, a cape that lets you jump in the air, and a set of gloves that allow you to dig through certain walls. The ability to map your various items to the A and B button assignments that make the most sense to you is a welcome addition to the game, though I know that I pretty much had my sword equipped constantly, with my other item slot acting as a rotatable selection for the various other items that I had picked up throughout my adventure. Given the amount of fighting you'll do throughout pretty much every aspect of the game, I've got to imagine that most other people played the game very similarly to me, which isn't really a critique, but is more of a simple observation. In addition to your assignable A and B buttons, the shoulder buttons on your Game Boy Advance also serve a purpose, with the R shoulder button being used as a form of multifunction context-sensitive input. If you're in the overall game world or in a dungeon, the R button will most often be used to roll, which can be used as both an evasive maneuver as well as a way to move faster through the environment than your typical walking speed. In other situations, R might be used to speak to a character or to grab onto an object to move it around. In all instances, this context-sensitive input felt entirely natural to use, though I will admit that a couple times during periods of intense action, my fingers instinctively went to the R button to use an item when in reality that item was assigned to either the A or B button. This is definitely a me problem as opposed to being a game problem, and I honestly don't know why my brain short-circuited like that, but regardless, I feel like it's worth mentioning. Your L shoulder button is also used at various points in the game, though from my recollection, it was only used to initiate kinstone combination sessions, which, while important in the overall context of the game, feels like a somewhat odd choice to dedicate a button to. It's not an issue, it's just something I noticed that felt kinda strange to me. Those simple controls, combined with moving around the game world using your directional pad, are what make up the overall control mechanics for the game, and in all instances, the controls feel as tight and modern as any other title that may be released today. There's both a simplicity and a timelessness to the control scheme in Minish Cap, and ultimately, it made the game very easy to pick up and play without any appreciable learning curve. And speaking of being easy to pick up and play, Minish Cap is a somewhat easier experience than you might expect. And other than a couple boss fights that I needed to figure out, and some areas with a ton of environmental damage, I don't think I ended up dying more than a handful of times. Luckily, the game does allow you to save your progress, so any deaths don't really impact your progression to any great extent, other than potentially dropping you back at the beginning of a dungeon, which can be a bit of a time sink to return to your prior location. The good news is that each dungeon implements a checkpointing system of sorts, where after you get to a certain part of a given dungeon, a portal will open up that can teleport you from the beginning of the dungeon to that location, effectively eliminating the need to progress through a bunch of rooms and encounters that you've already cleared. I loved this addition to the game, and felt like it really did eliminate a lot of the tedium and frustration that can sometimes accompany a late dungeon death in a Zelda title. Otherwise, and considering all of the aspects of the game we've already talked about, Minish Cap does so many things right and creates such a compelling combination of varied mechanics, new innovations, and traditional gameplay that it stands out as a unique experience within the overall Legend of Zelda franchise, and one that I truly feel is one of the best two-dimensional Zelda titles ever created. I admit I have not played them all, but I can still safely say that Minish Cap is truly something special. So, what is our verdict on Minish Cap? Well, The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap is an amazing game from beginning to end, and as a result, is a surefire addition to our pantheon of classic gaming. In fact, there wasn't a single moment playing the game where I ever had any doubt. It is that good, and that well designed. I know some of you might think such a statement would suggest I was blinded by the sheer excellence of the Zelda pedigree, but I assure you that was not the case. Minish Cap is simply a high-quality, superbly designed title, and if you, like me, have put off playing it, consider this your invitation to fire it up and dive into the game. I can guarantee you'll have a good time, and who knows, you may even end up finding a new favorite Zelda adventure. I personally can't quite call Minish Cap my favorite Zelda title overall, but it is absolutely one of my favorite Zelda games I have ever played, which is why, for me, The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap has just become the newest inductee into our pantheon of classic gaming. That was our episode on The Legend of Zelda: Minish Cap. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, Patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Gabriel Knight, Sins of the Fathers. So feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings. Though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Gabriel Knight, Sins of the Fathers. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.